Isobel Whitelegg, who's an art historian, curator, lecturer at the University of Leicester, and who has done research on Brazilian art for many, many years. Isobel did her PhD on Neuroshango, Brazilian artist Neuroshango, and has written extensively about several different Brazilian artists.
What I do is talk a little bit about, I suppose, like a bit of a history and archaeology of how Brazilian art and Brazilian artists have been present, particularly in London, actually, but in the UK more broadly. And beginning with, I think when you're talking about the presence of contemporary artists from Brazil, the moment people talk about a lot, people who are interested in the subject at least, talk about a lot, is a gallery called Signals that opened in London in 1964, and it only lasted for 2 years for various reasons. It was trying to be sustainable economically, and it was all at the same time very experimental, so it wasn't a model that necessarily was able to self-fund. But Signals is very important now and very acknowledged because it was the place where the artists of that generation of the 60s and of the 70s, who are now the most well-known here and internationally, the most valuable in terms of how their work circulates in the market too. The first place they were exhibited was this gallery, Signals, in London. And it was right in the middle of central London, just behind Oxford Street, the corner of Wigmore and Wimpole Street. And it used to be a building owned by the father of the director. The director was a guy called Paul Keeler, and the building was owned by his father, who was a manufacturer of optical machinery. So he let his son use it as a gallery. And it had 3 floors. First of all, it only used the first floor, but then it gradually kind of developed the 3 levels of the building. And it connected to Latin America largely via Paris, because at this time there were a number of artists from Latin America who were either permanently or on a long-term basis living in Paris. And Signals was particularly concerned with a type of art that's quite difficult to define, but kinetic art, which is art that's concerned in very different ways with the idea of movement. And it doesn't necessarily mean kind of mechanized works that physically move, but more the idea of works being kind of dynamic or changeable. And there were a number of artists connected with this tendency, based in Paris, but also in London and various cities within the UK as well. So it set out to look at this idea of art and movement, and actually also the relationship between artistic thought and scientific thought. So from the beginning, there were a number of artists from Latin America involved in its network, and it operated in a very networked way. The 3 people who are very connected with the history of Signals are Paul Keeler, who is the director, who now no longer really works directly with art, but importantly the art critic and curator Guy Brett, who was very young when Signals started. He was about 22, and the art critic for the Times, and had been very involved with visual art since he was really at school. And so he got involved in this enterprise through his friendship with Paul Keeler. And also the artist David Medalla was one of the original founders as well as Gustav Metzger. And another artist who people don't always remember as well, there was an Italian artist called Marcello Salvadori. So they started off this enterprise, opened the building, and already had a connection, a network of artists that involved artists from Brazil. And the artist who they were collaborated most closely with was an artist called Sergio Camargo. I think there's a picture of his work on their news bulletin on the next page. They also published for every exhibition they did, every solo exhibition, they published a news bulletin, which you can actually, I think you can, there's still some of the facsimile copies of this available actually. It's a really interesting document. Innova produced a facsimile in '95 or so. So Camargo was important in terms of his relationship with Guy Brett and David Medalla and the others. But he was also really important to how they went on to be connected with Brazilian art. Because in a way, an artist like Camargo was already fairly well known in Europe. He'd won a prize at the Paris Biennial for sculpture. He already had a place in the market, actually, in the UK. But he made recommendations beyond this circuit that was very European-based. And he introduced signals to the work of Ligia Clark and the work of Elio Tessica and the work of Mira Schendel. And so actually it's particularly the work of Tessica and Schendel that's quite distinct in terms of signals knowledge about Brazilian artists, because Ligia Clark also had exhibited to some extent in Europe and had some connections with Paris, but Tessica and Mira Schendel were quite kind of an unusual perspective, and their work didn't necessarily relate to this more geometric idea of kinetic art. So actually Brazil was one of the countries that was most strongly represented by signals. Brazil and Venezuela actually were the countries where the majority of artists they showed in solo exhibition were from those two countries. And that was partly through how Guy Brett and others travelled, but also, admittedly at this moment, there was a very, they had a very strong place in how people imagined Latin America at that time. So Venezuela was seen as a very kind of future-facing, modern country. It was building new architecture. There were kind of clips and newsreels shown in cinemas here that showed it as a kind of equivalent to swinging London. And Brazil similarly, that people knew about the construction of Brasilia, for example, as a new capital city. People here knew about it. So there was a sense in which people were perceiving those countries as being kind of very, like cities of the future. If you imagine London has just gone through the Second World War and kind of rebuilt after that, they had this interest in kind of new places. So even though at the time Signals was open, these countries were entering into very difficult, very repressive political circumstances. This kind of popular idea of Brazil was very present. And Signals was a very popular place, so it wasn't just kind of art world people, partly because it was interested in art and science. You'd get kind of doctors and nurses and an unusual cross-section of people there. And it would be shown on these documentaries that you sometimes find clips of on the internet of kind of people being fascinated by new contemporary art that moves and that kind of thing. So it had a kind of popular side as well. One of the legacies that's very real for Signals, in terms of it being tangible now, is that they also sold work. And I think the Tate's first acquisition of a post-war Brazilian work was via Signals, and it was a work by Sergio Camargo, which they bought in about 64, 65 by Signals, which is on the next slide actually. So there's a load of work that was shown at Signals. Camargo was the only Brazilian artist they bought, but Tate also bought work by Venezuelan abstract artists like Diaz and Soto directly from Signals. What's interesting now is that work was never shown until the early 2000s. So it was in the storage unit in the different locations where work has been shown for a very long time. I think it was possibly bought actually as European work rather than Latin American work, because these artists were represented in a kind of European circuit. But the first time I saw this work, I was a student, and I saw it in like a great big storage centre in Elephant Castle, and it didn't come out until around 2002, which is when Tate set up a specific acquisition committee for Latin American art. After Signals, so Signals closed in '66, and after Signals, actually, some of the places that were really important for Brazilian and Latin American art tended to be more like non-collecting places. So places like the Whitechapel or Modern Art Oxford, Camden. These were the places where you saw more of an international representation at that time, and they're quite significant. Significant shows at those places were kind of legacy of Signal. So Elio Tosica, for example, Signal wanted to do a solo exhibition of his work, but they closed before it happened, and eventually Guy Brett was able to negotiate that with Whitechapel. So he did a solo exhibition in Whitechapel in '69, and like a prop which kind of connects this legacy with Whitechapel, but also with Tate. So when Tate, in much more recent years, showed a retrospective of Oiticica, they also published a book which was about Oiticica in London. So we're looking at the exhibition that he did at the Whitechapel. They produced kind of new interviews with people who met at the time, looked a bit at the legacy of Signals, but also I think it says something about how we think about how we relate to Brazilian art here. So in a way you have to almost justify that relationship, because there's no, it's not that you assume a natural relationship between the UK and Brazil, but the relationship exists via how people have come here and exhibited here. So in a way, Tate doing this project and this research, it kind of rooted this travelling Oiticica exhibition, and it travelled from the USA to Tate. Doing this book and a collection display around it was a way of kind of making sense of how Brazil fits into their picture and fits into our connection with places other than England, which fortunately we have for the time being, at least. Sorry. Sorry? Oh yeah, sure, yeah. I'm sure I can left something. Of course. I think you might still be able to get a hold of it, but not 100% certain. So this is the Ligia Clark solo exhibition. So this was the first time her work was shown in the UK, and it was very comprehensive. It was a quite precarious space in a way, not a museum space, but they tended to show, the artists they showed in solo exhibitions, they wouldn't just show current work, they were almost like mini retrospectives. And the important thing I need to mention is that these photographs also are by one person. So there's a photographer named Clay Perry who took all of the photos of Signals, and he actually works with a gallery called England & Co, who, there's a number of photos from Signals that are already in circulation, but they're slowly going through his whole archive. So we're getting a much bigger, more detailed picture of how they showed things, which was quite interesting actually. It's not necessarily something that people have looked at closely, but with Ligia Clark's work, it's quite interesting to see how they dealt with these works that were designed to be manipulated and touched. So you get a sense of them trying to come to terms with new types of art, and actually the Brazilian artists were really good at challenging them on that basis, because they didn't know, or didn't always know which works were going to arrive. They did kind of negotiations with galleries in Paris, and when these works, which are the bichus, which are the ones where you touch, they kind of move in reaction to how you're manipulating them. When they arrived, they'd never seen these works before, so it was important as a place that took certain risks as well, which is something that I think is hard to do, but part of their legacy is that they did take certain risks on artists that were less well known. I can't remember where I was going now. Oh yeah, okay, so this is another really important moment. In between, say, something like Signals and Brazilian art becoming something that we can see now in the permanent collections of Tate. It's integrated within the collection displays. A collection that began actually in 1993 at the University of Essex, which is where I studied actually for my MA and my PhD. It's still the only place really that offers specialist study in Latin American art. And at that time in the 90s, they were becoming increasingly aware of the problem with teaching Latin American art being that it wasn't physically present, so there was very little of it that they could use. And as a department, they were very, they had a real emphasis on thinking about the object itself, and really thinking about how you think about it in kind of aesthetic terms, but your artwork as an art historian being based on actually seeing these things. So their engagement with Latin American art was a bit of a problem, because they couldn't actually show it to people. There wasn't anywhere near as much Latin American art around as there is now, in terms of exhibitions or collections that are on display. So they began in '93, and there's a very important connection to Brazil here too, because they had he was a PhD student at the time, a man named Charles Kozak. He was doing his PhD at Essex, and went on, I don't think he was at the time, but went on to be one of the most successful publishers of art books in Brazil. He no longer has his publisher, it closed last year, but he made quite a lot of the founding donations to this collection. It's all by donation. So he negotiated a lot of the Brazilian works that were first given to the collection were via this relationship with a certain PhD student, and including this work by Amilcar de Castro, who was a member of the neo-concrete movement by Bishop Clark, and this work is in the grounds of the University of Essex. And there'll be a number of works that came in at that moment in the 90s via this relationship with Brazil. And this collection really was the first to recognise the value of having the works physically here so they could be researched in depth. And these days the collection is used in quite a similar way. It's really seen as being primarily a collection that's connected to teaching and is used for teaching, but also fed by different PhD students who come. So people who come from Brazil and other Latin American countries have kind of contributed research to the collection. So this is an important part of the picture of how Brazilian art has kind of entered into wider knowledge here. So, and actually with signals, which I went on to research quite a lot in a very geeky way, it was actually one of the professors at Essex who first told me about it, Dawn Adders, who was also the first to curate a survey exhibition of 20th century Latin American art, which was back in 1989 at Hayward. So Essex is also, I think, part of this picture of how Brazilian art is shown now, and part of the problem, not a problem in a necessarily negative way, but a bit of a conundrum. So now you can see Brazilian art, and it's shown in a non-kind of nationally specific way. Latin American art is shown in a non-nationally specific way, because that's how it is, because it's how it circulates, because it's understood here as much as it's understood there, maybe in different ways. But at the same time, I think places like Essex have this value of concentrating on a particular country and kind of going into more depth. And at the same time, there are limitations, because maybe they just put everything kind of in a box and create boundaries. But at the moment, I think the tendency with how Brazilian art is shown here is much more towards that idea of thinking about its relationships. So if we think about the Brazilian art that we can see now, in terms of permanent displays or permanent ownership of Brazilian art, so that means the Tate, essentially, as the only really major national collection of modern contemporary art that we have of a scale that's on permanent display. The way they approach Latin American art or Brazilian art specifically is very much in terms of these relationships and interconnections. So when they open their new wing, their new building, next week, one of the devices they're using is identifying these points of contact that relate to works in the collections, and one of them is Sao Paulo Biennial. So they've looked at works not only from Brazil, but works that are were acquired from the biennial or were shown there. So they're very much kind of suggesting that this is the way that we can understand the international, this is the way that we can understand how Brazilian art has influenced us, or how Brazil, as a place that has a very long established biennial, has been influential to art internationally. So it seems like the place that is showing what the main tendency for thinking about Brazilian art is, because Tate has this kind of visibility, this centrality, would be wanting us to understand Brazilian art in terms of these connections. And another one of the devices they're using is looking at a centre for art that was in Argentina. So I think that this is something that it'll be interesting to see how people respond to that, and think about what that implies about how they deal with countries that previously they didn't collect with as much kind of conviction, they didn't show, and they didn't include. So it's interesting to kind of look at the kind of models they offer, and how perhaps different pictures are given by thinking about how Brazil relates to its own national context, or to the continent of Latin America specifically, or to more broadly the global south specifically. I think I'm probably spoken for more than 15 minutes. Yeah, so sorry, one final thing I'm going to mention. I was checking, so when the acquisitions committee was set up at Tate, this was the first work that they bought, which is a work by Ricardo Basbaum, Capsules. And this, I think, will be on display actually in the new wing. Yes.
By an American?
I think it somehow involves Beyonce's younger sister.
What?
Yeah, a performance by Beyonce's younger sister was a choreographer, no?
Yes. Yeah, let's say she, yeah, Solange, no.
So that's a choreographer.
It's a, yeah, I think yeah. I'm sure she's a person in her own right, no.
The one who kicked Jay-Z on the leg.
Yes.
Now I know.
Yeah, the fearsome one, actually. So this is, it's I actually asked, I asked somebody at Tate which was the first Brazilian work they bought, but evidently it was this one, which came up at the first kind of acquisition committee meeting. It's a shame Catherine's not here, because she would have kind of annotated a bit my discussion of that committee, because she's involved in it. And that's the kind of main forum via which Brazilian art enters Tate. So they work with they call him like an adjunct curator, who changes every 2 years or so, and currently is a curator integrator. And with experts and with philanthropists to acquire works from the collection. I'm not exactly sure how many works from Brazil are in the collection now. I tried to find out, but I was a bit kind of, by looking at the collection as it's catalogued online, but I didn't want to kind of rely too much on that, because I think there's always a delay between what's bought and what's enters the collection. But it'd be really interesting to know actually how those proportions are shifted. I don't think it will be a huge amount, it will be less than 100 actually, but yeah. Someone should do that. Okay. So I think I've said enough. I've concentrated a lot on this idea of things that stay here permanently, because I think it's always a big commitment when a museum buys something. It's always like it's a big kind of form of acceptance. And yeah, unless you can talk about actual living, breathing
the fleeting.
Yeah.